In the name of the Emperor and the forgotten oaths of brotherhood, let us speak of Warhammer Dantioch, Warsmith, builder, exile, a warrior clad in iron, forged in shame and reborn in loyalty. His name is a rarity among the cursed, a bright ember flickering amidst the ashes of a fallen legion. He was not always an outcast. In the days before betrayal, before the madness of Horus and the sundering of legions, Dantioch stood proud among the Iron Warriors, Perturabo's favored, a master of fortification, siege, and strategic perfection. His brilliance was neither quiet nor boastful. It was evident in the symmetry of every bastion he raised, the lethal precision of every battlefield he planned. He served the Great Crusade in the 51st Expeditionary Fleet, a command granted only to the most capable among the Astartes. Not merely a captain or tactician, but a warsmith, a title earned, not given. The 51st carved its way through void and world alike, reducing Xeno's strongholds to ruin, teaching stubborn human civilizations the cost of resistance. Dantioch's hammer and mind were one, swift, heavy, unrelenting. Yet it was not blade or bolter that would bring Dantioch low, but the impossible, an enemy that warped time itself. The campaign against the Hrud. At the edge of the Vulpa Straits, a migratory cluster of Hrud emerged from the Shadow Realms, spreading decay and collapse. Their passage twisted causality, their presence a slow cancer on reality itself. When the 51st arrived at the fortress world of Golgis, they found rot where they had once placed order. Structures aged centuries in weeks, steel rusted at a glance. Men withered to husks without cause. Time was the enemy, and the Hrud wielded it with instinctual malice. Dantioch did not flinch. He ordered countermeasures, sealed time distortion zones with mass reactive barriers, pulled men back from chronometric hot zones. But how does one fight entropy with stone? How do you outmaneuver the erosion of reality itself? He tried. Emperor knows he tried. When the campaign ended, if such a thing can be said for a war against the collapse of time, Dantioch emerged alive, but not whole. His body aged beyond its years, joints stiff with premature decay, a face worn and creased beneath his helm. The apothecaries could only slow what the Hrud had started. What was taken would not be returned. And for all that effort, all that pain, Perturabo gave him only scorn. A campaign that did not end in conquest was a failure. Golgis was lost, and Dantioch had failed to hold it. That he survived at all was taken as a blemish, a sign of weakness, not endurance. The Lord of Iron had little room in his cold calculus for mercy. Dantioch was summoned to stand before his Primarch. No words of comfort, no understanding, just condemnation. He was stripped of command, relieved of the 51st, marked if not by name as a cautionary tale. Perturabo exiled him to Lesser Damantine, a strategic backwater of no consequence, ordered to fortify it as a punishment, not a mission, a place where failures were forgotten. And still, Dantioch obeyed. On Lesser Damantine, he found nothing but dust, rock, and silence. And yet, as he surveyed that wasteland, he did what he had always done. He began to build. Not for glory, not for reward, but because it was all he had left. He built the Schadenhold, a fortress worthy of the Fourth Legion's ideals. It rose like a bastion from myth, shielded by layered void fields, defended by autocannon bastions, fed by subterranean reactors. Dantioch poured his pain into every stone. This was no monument to himself. It was a rejection of Perturabo's scorn, a declaration that he would not be broken. And while the builders worked, the warsmith crafted something else, his mask. They say he forged it in silence, unassisted. A crude iron faceplate, beaten into shape upon a flame-blackened anvil. When it was finished, glowing red with heat, he donned it without pause, and when it seared against his skin, he did not scream. When it cooled, it fused to him, flesh to iron, a mask for a man forgotten. He wore it ever after, the mark of his disgrace and his rebirth. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice echoed with metallic resonance, a reminder of the pain he had endured and the iron will he had found within. Years passed. Lesser Damantine became a fortress world under his rule, its lonely skies watched by batteries that could punch through a cruiser's hull. Dantioch trained its garrison personally, teaching not just tactics, but resilience. He taught them that strength is not measured by victory, but by what you endure when victory is denied. And while the Imperium burned elsewhere, while brothers turned against brothers, Dantioch watched. He read the astropathic fragments. He sifted through rumor and coded cry for help. Words like Istvan, massacre, betrayal echoed in the void. He did not want to believe, could not. But deep within, in the unspoken silence beneath his mask, he knew what was coming. He had lived with betrayal, his Primarchs, his legions. He had survived the death of hope once before, but the galaxy was about to teach Barabbas Dantioch a crueler lesson still. And so the Warsmith waited in his bastion of stone and silence, watching for the storm he knew must come, for he had not built the Schadenhold as a tomb. He had built it as a defiance, against time, against fate, and against the very gods of chaos. The galaxy would soon forget many heroes, but it would remember this fortress, and it would remember the man who built it. Barabbas Dantioch, the Iron Warrior who did not bend, the builder of stone and of resolve. This is where his legend begins. The fortress stood like a monolith, watching over barren plains, its spires like accusing fingers clawing at a gray sky. Deep within its heart moved the man who had built it, slowly, steadily, with the weight of age resting on his armored shoulders. He was a lord of iron once, a name spoken in reverence across dozens of battlefronts. Now he was a forgotten sentinel entombed in his own creation. The galaxy knew him no longer, but he remembered everything. Barabbas Dantioch did not forget. Each day began in silence, no grand parade, no rallies of banners or salutes of glory. The clang of servitor footsteps echoed through the stone corridors. The hum of Auspex arrays tuned themselves without command. Tech priests scuttled like beetles, maintaining systems designed by a mind sharper than any of their own. Lesser Damantine was a post abandoned by hope, but within its walls Dantioch still labored, not for victory, not for vengeance, but for duty. He walked the halls with a measured step, not because of pride, but because of pain. His body, ravaged by exposure to the Hrude's temporal decay, was no longer what it had been. The aches never faded. Movement was a calculation. Each shift of power armor was met with a dozen quiet stabs behind the skin. The apothecaries had offered bionics. He refused. Metal had failed his legion. He would not replace what was lost with imitation. Let his suffering be real. His mask remained ever in place. To his soldiers, it became a legend. They said he had forged it in the depths of a forge cathedral, alone, that it had been placed upon his face while still glowing red. They whispered that beneath it was a face so aged it shamed even the most venerable dreadnought. The truth was simpler and sadder. The mask was anonymity, a wall between the man he had been and the figure he now played. Behind it, he could be the Warsmith. Behind it, he could pretend he had never failed. His garrison numbered few, a contingent of iron warriors once loyal to him, veterans too old or too stubborn to change allegiance. Astra Militarum conscripts whose planetary oaths kept them stationed at the edge of nowhere, a smattering of Mechanicum adepts obsessed with the fortress's machinery, and perhaps 100 mortal laborers who knew only that their commanding officer never slept, never praised, never punished unjustly. To them, Dantioch was not a commander, but a ghost in iron. He did not speak unless required. Orders were given through vox hisses or silent gesture. He drilled his troops in tactics of containment, of reinforcement, of denial, always denial. The fortress was designed not to win battles, but to prevent them. Every corridor was a death trap, every approach a killing field. Dantioch did not build fortresses to keep enemies out. He built them to kill anything foolish enough to come in. Sometimes at night, he would climb the highest watchtower and gaze out at the sky. There were no stars to see. Lesser Damantine's atmosphere was thick with iron oxide clouds and the constant echo of industrial runoff. But he looked anyway. Somewhere out there, his brothers were making war. Somewhere out there, Perturabo had turned his attention from conquest to rebellion. He had no proof, only whispers in the void. But the truth pressed on him like gravity. He had heard it. A name carried on static blurred transmissions, Istvan, a massacre, a slaughter of the loyal by their own kin. The words were fragmented, coded, half lost. But he knew the pattern. You didn't need a clear message when the ghosts screamed loud enough. He sat in his command sanctum, an austere chamber of stone and slate, dominated by a single hollow table and an iron throne bolted into the floor. Around him, peak feeds buzzed with faint distortion. Surveillance logs fed directly into his armor's link. 1,000 data points flickered across his vision, but none held his gaze. It was the silence that disturbed him. The 4th Legion had stopped transmitting. They had always been cold, always brutal, but they had never been silent. For years, he had tracked movement reports, ship manifests, occasional communiques from old comrades who still had the decency to pity him. But now, nothing. An entire legion had turned inward. He recognized the pattern. He had seen it once before, on Olympia, when Perturabo ordered entire cities razed for resisting his tribute. Dantioch had built cities, not burned them. He had honored the Empire by shaping worlds, not reducing them. That had always been the tension between them. Perturabo believed that order came through destruction. Dantioch believed it came through structure. It was a difference deep enough to bury them both. He stared into the hollow table, its flickering map of Imperial sectors now mottled with red. He tapped a sequence of symbols, unlocking encrypted files from the wider command network. Reports came in fragmented. Calth in flames. Ultramar under siege. Word-bearers gone mad. Horus declared Warmaster no longer in name, but in deed. It was as though the galaxy had begun to unravel, and it had begun exactly as he had feared. A knock at his chamber's door. It was no servitor. He turned. Legionnaire Morian stood there, one of the few iron warriors who had stayed loyal, his armor battle-worn but serviceable. He removed his helm respectfully. "Warsmith," he said, voice low, almost uncertain. "There's a signal, a fleet approaching the system. Transponder codes, RIV Legion." Dantioch did not reply immediately. He turned back to the hollow table. The red sector glowed. The silence was broken, and the voice that shattered it carried the markings of treachery. "Is it Krendel?" he asked at last. "Yes, sir. The 14th Grand Company." Dantioch was silent for a long moment. Then, with a hiss of hydraulics, he stood from the iron throne. "Ready the Schadenhold. Lock down all outer gates. Arm the void shields and prime the counter batteries." "They're hailing us," Morian said, "requesting parley." Let them speak, but make ready for siege. We've waited long enough in silence." He moved to the arming dais, where his thunderhammer, Gatebreaker, rested in solemn silence. He lifted it with both hands. The motion was painful but necessary. The time for watching was over. As the fortress rumbled into wartime operation, as defense turrets rotated and energy shields flickered into place, Dantioch moved with a calm determination. He knew the voice that would soon greet him across the Vox. A brother once, now a servant of Perturabo's madness. This was no longer exile. This was no longer punishment. This was war. The loyal Iron Warrior turned toward the calm panel, mask expressionless, voice like grinding metal. "Let them speak their lies," he said. "Then we show them what true loyalty looks like." And so the fortress groaned to life, its walls singing the song of war, while within them stood the man who had been discarded, broken, and forgotten, now steel-tempered and ready to fight. The lonely war was about to begin. The first thing Warhammer Dantioch heard was the voice, cracked with static, thick with filtered malice, a familiar tone that clawed at memory and unspoken pain. "Warsmith Dantioch, I bring greetings from our father. He calls you home, brother." The transmission hung in the air like a venomous mist, bleeding through the command sanctum's Vox grill. Across the fortress's calm channel, the voice belonged to Warsmith Crendel, a once loyal subordinate, now a herald of something worse than betrayal, something cold, methodical, dutiful in its treachery. Dantioch stood still, not rigid, not frozen in fear, still, like a statue that had been waiting for this precise moment to awaken. He knew Crendel, had trained him, had seen the potential in him once. A capable siege officer, quick-thinking, ruthlessly efficient, but always a man who followed power over principle. Now he wore Perturabo's orders like a second skin. "You are relieved of command," the voice continued. "Lesser Damantine is required for the War Master's advance. You will comply, or you will be removed. No threats, no declarations of war, just a statement of fact, inevitable, cruel in its certainty." The Iron Warriors had returned, but not the kind he had led. These were the architects of Horus's dream, the agents of the great betrayal. Dantioch let the Vox fall silent. He didn't answer immediately. He walked to the viewport of his sanctum and gazed outward through the armor glass. In the distant skies above Damantine, pinpricks of light shimmered. Too many to be traders, too close for a patrol. A fleet, growing larger by the hour. Warships bearing the sigils of the 4th Legion, his legion. And somewhere among them, he knew, Crendel's ship circled like a predator, waiting for its prey to bleed. The data came in streams, sensor logs mapping out fleet formations, patterns of movement along the orbital plane, landing ships preparing for descent, siege platforms unfolding like vultures, spreading their wings. Dantioch analyzed them as if reading the pages of a history book, because he had seen these maneuvers before, had taught them, perfected them. Now he would be on the receiving end of his own legacy. He keyed the Vox. His voice was a low grind, measured but resolute. "You carry Perturabo's voice in your lungs, Crendel. But I wonder, do you still carry the Emperor in your heart?" There was a pause, not long enough for contemplation, only for calculation. "The Emperor is dead," Crendel answered. "He just doesn't know it yet." Dantioch didn't respond. There was no need. The channel closed with a hiss. Orders followed. He summoned his commanders, Morian, ancient Drivax, the human garrison leaders, the Skitari overseers. A holographic map of Lesser Damantine's surface flickered into motion at the heart of the war room. Terrain markers, kill zones, shield thresholds. Dantioch didn't raise his voice, didn't command through force. he explained. "This wall will fall in 5 days unless reinforced. These batteries must be rotated every 4 hours to avoid saturation. This chamber will be the fallback point, each fact landed like a hammer." "You've trained for this," he said. "Now you live it." Among the humans, there were no cheers. Among the Astartes, no exultation. That was not the way of the Iron Warriors. What they gave was a nod, a thud of a fist to chest plate, a silent understanding. They would fight. Not for honor, not for victory, but because they had been given the burden of defense, and by Dantioch's will, they would not yield it lightly. Preparations unfolded like clockwork. Servitor-carried macro shells were stacked along the upper ramparts. Plasma banks pulsed with quiet energy. Trenches were filled with liquid promethium to be ignited should the outer walls fall. Every corridor became a puzzle of kill zones. Every lift shaft became a grave waiting to be filled. The Schadenhold was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. Dantioch had laid it long ago, perhaps for this exact moment, and now the enemy had come to step inside. The first barrage fell on the 8th hour. Krendel's fleet opened fire with massed cyclonic torpedoes and precision shelling. The skies above Lesser Damantine lit up like a storm god's fury. Atmospheric filters buckled under the strain. Void shields shimmered, faltered, flared again. Dantioch watched each breach report with the detached calm of a surgeon measuring blood loss. Seal Sector 12. Begin auxiliary fusion override. Reroute coolant through the western pipeway. No. Manually. I want eyes on it. He gave no speeches. He needed none. His orders were the voice of the fortress, and the fortress, like its master, did not break. The enemy landed on the 3rd day. Krendel's dropships came in waves, armored claws raking across the planet's surface. Iron warriors, sons of Olympia in all but spirit, disembarked in tight formations. They moved with precision, their armor marked by the 8-pointed star of the War Master. Dantioch watched them from the upper ramparts, his iron mask unreadable. Somewhere out there in that sea of steel and hate were men who had fought beside him, shared rations, buried comrades, laughed in rare moments around low-burn fires. Now they marched to kill him. That was the price of loyalty, not the glory of banners, the cost of loneliness. The Schadenhold returned fire with the cold wrath of a cornered god. Turrets spat streams of tracer rounds into the sky. Plasma cannons roared, cutting dropships from the sky like falling leaves. Trenches erupted in flame as invaders crossed the ignition lines. And yet they kept coming. They were iron warriors. The pain was irrelevant. The goal was everything. On the 4th day, Krendel sent a message. "You know this fortress won't hold. Why make them suffer? I'm offering you a chance to end this with dignity." Dantioch stared at the message in silence. Then he sent a simple reply. "I taught you how to siege, Krendel. Let's see if you were listening." And the channel went dark. That night, he walked the walls. He passed by the bodies being stacked and counted. Marines covered in soot and gore bowed their heads as he passed. He paused only once, beside a wounded soldier, barely more than a boy, shivering beneath a heat lamp, missing an arm and still clutching a stubber in his remaining hand. "You held the line," Dantioch said. "Didn't want to disappoint you, sir," the boy murmured. Dantioch knelt, laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. No more words passed between them. But the boy wept and didn't stop until Dantioch was gone. In the command sanctum, alone once more, Dantioch gazed again at the fleet overhead. He had expected this confrontation, had anticipated every move Krendel would make, but beneath the calculations and projections, there was something else, a question he could no longer silence. Would Perturabo have come himself? Would the Lord of Iron, his Primarch, his father, look upon the fortress he had built and see not a traitor, but a son? He knew the answer, and yet some stubborn, wounded place within him still asked. The siege had begun. The echoes of Olympia had come calling, and Barabbas Dantioch, forsaken by his legion, answered them not with surrender, but with stone, steel, and silence. The war for Lesser Damantine was no longer theoretical. It was real, it was personal, and it had only just begun. The first walls trembled on the 6th day. It wasn't a breach, not yet. Not a full one, just a quake, a deep, shaking groan that reverberated through the ceramite bones of the Schadenhold. A warning from the earth itself, as if even the rock could sense the weight of the conflict settling into its cracks. But the fortress held. It had to. Outside, the iron sky boiled with flame. Krendel's siege engines had been deployed in full, heavy macro-artillery platforms, torsion mortars, and gravity-hammered breacher cannons. They ringed the outer defense perimeter like a noose slowly tightening around the fortress's throat. It was textbook by Iron Warriors standards. Methodical, precise, cold. Dantioch had seen this doctrine play out on 100 worlds, but this time he was the one in the kill box. He watched it unfold through a dozen vid feeds glowing above the war map like floating ghosts. Cluster barrages pounded the eastern curtain wall, causing avalanches of rubble that buried trenches. A massive thud-thump rhythm shook the foundations as Krendel's ordnance began targeting structural stress points, trying not to shatter the wall but to weaken it, crack it, make it yield its secrets under pressure, just as they had done to fortresses across the stars. But this fortress wasn't theirs. Dantioch stood in the upper command bastion, surrounded by flickering glyphs and vox snarls. The air stank of ozone, burning insulation, and blood. He hadn't left the control tower in 30 hours. His mind churned through data with an engineer's precision. Power readings, munitions counts, life sign tracers, shield fluctuations. Every pulse of information was a symptom. Every alert, a clue. If the Schadenhold was a living thing, then Barabbas Dantioch was its physician, its guardian, and its priest. One section at a time, the walls were tested. Krendel was looking for a weakness. Dantioch gave him none. Gate 13, reinforce with thermal plating. They're zeroing in with grav punchers. Deploy countermines on the western sally port. I want the next breach attempt met with fire. No, do not reroute auxiliary power from the keep reactors. Let the outer grid fail before the core dims. If they get that far, we're already dead. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were iron. His orders moved through the chain of command like a current. His warriors obeyed not from fear or doctrine, but from something deeper. Belief. Belief in the one man who had never left, never bent, never lied to them. By the 7th day, the outer bastions had begun to fall. Krendel sent forward his breachers, squads of iron warriors in reinforced plate, wielding melta charges and siege claws. They came in silence. They always did. No cries of faith, no shrieks of heresy, just the thunder of boots and the hum of weapons, as if war were not a scream, but a ritual. Dantioch watched the squads move like water around his traps. Even now, he admired the discipline, the clarity. Krendel hadn't forgotten his teachings. Every movement was surgical. Every advance was calculated to bleed defenders, not shatter them. He wanted to grind the Schadenhold down, layer by layer, until it gave way under its own exhaustion. But if he thought Dantioch would give him the satisfaction of collapse, he didn't know the fortress like its creator did. Every wall that fell had a fallback line. Every dead-end corridor opened into a kill zone. Behind each sealed bulkhead was another choke point, each chamber cross-lit with overlapping arcs of fire. The fortress was not linear. It was a spiral, a trap that folded in on itself. Dantioch hadn't just designed it to hold off attackers, he had designed it to consume them. As the enemy pressed inward, they began to understand. Inside the breach lines, the fighting was like nothing either side had ever endured. It was not war as most imagined it, no great charges, no thunderous duels. It was a crawling, grinding hell. Short-range plasma detonations turned hallways into butcher's chambers. Astartes bled out on piles of shattered ceramite and ruptured promethium lines. Grenades were rolled into ducts. Vox traffic dissolved into screams. Dantioch did not weep for them, not even for the ones who once called him brother. He moved through the rear lines without escort. Marines saluted him as he passed. He returned none of them. Not out of pride, but necessity. A symbol does not bow. A foundation does not falter. In the infirmary tunnels, he paused to observe the wounded. A legionnaire missing both legs still barked orders to a green recruit through clenched teeth. A tech adept soldered replacement organs together with machine oils while repeating the Omnissiah's canticles in a monotone. Dantioch said nothing. He knelt beside a dying mortal guardsman, adjusted the man's rebreather so he wouldn't choke on his own blood, then stood, then moved on. In the silence of a ruined lift shaft, he received another message from Krendel. "You can't win this. You know that. There's no relief coming, no reinforcements, no loyalist fleet is en route. You are alone. Just die well." Dantioch stared at the words for a long time. Then he deleted them. Alone? Perhaps, but that had never stopped him before. On the 8th day, the enemy breached the Gate of Chains. This had once been the main entrance into the fortress, now sealed for over a decade. Dantioch had mined it heavily, believing it too obvious a vector. Krendel had guessed he wouldn't expect the direct approach. He was half right. When the breach charges detonated, the outer gate ruptured in a cone of flame and debris. Krendel's elite stepped through, iron warriors with demonic heraldry now etched into their armor, their helmets sculpted into leering skulls, their bolters modified with corrupted munitions. They were no longer merely traitors. They were something worse, something born from the warp. But Dantioch had expected even that. The moment they passed through, the floor beneath them collapsed. Dozens of Astartes plummeted into a shaft filled with magnetic mines and gravshear plates. The survivors scrambled upward, only to meet suppressive fire from 3 different levels. A handful made it out. None advanced. Later that night, as the battle raged on, Dantioch stood before the gate's shattered ruin and left behind a message, scrawled in chemical paint across a slab of stone, bolted to the rubble. "Your memory of me is flawed." On the 9th day, Krendel unleashed something new. An orbital weapon, unnamed, unmarked, illegal even by Mechanicum standards. It rained molten iron shards at hypersonic velocity, shearing through the upper levels of the fortress like divine retribution. Entire sections vaporized, towers crumbled. The East Quadrant command relay, gone. Dozens dead. Dantioch himself was caught in the collapse, buried under tons of steelcrete. It took his men 6 hours to dig him out. When they did, he emerged on his own power, one arm broken, one leg fractured, his mask cracked. But his voice, when it rasped through the Vox, was steady. "Begin counter-strike protocol. Section 12. Lure them through the dust. We still hold the grid line." And so they did. On the 10th day, the Schadenhold still stood. Not whole, not proud, but alive. blood stained every corridor. Power flickered in half the systems, but the walls had not fallen. Dantioch had not fallen. And in orbit, Krendel's patience began to die. This was not the siege he had imagined, not the easy purge of a relic and a relic's fortress. This was war in its truest form, cruel, exhausting, infinite. And as Dantioch stood amid the ruins of his bastion, rearming with one good hand, he whispered a line that only one other voice heard, one that belonged to no mortal. "Iron within," he murmured, "iron without." And the fortress answered, with fire. The fortress had bled, the stone had cracked, but it had not broken. 10 days into the siege, the Schadenhold was a ruinous warren of collapsed passageways, makeshift barricades, and smoke-choked vaults. But it was still alive, still functional in the ways that mattered. Its void shields were scorched but flickering, its gun towers blackened but firing, its defenders weary but unbowed, and at its heart the Warsmith walked on. Dantioch had not slept in 5 days. Sleep was a luxury for men who could afford hope. He had passed from exhaustion into a kind of mechanical awareness, every moment devoted to action, analysis, survival. His mind catalogued the wounded, rerouted power, adjusted gun trajectories, reinforced bulkheads. He no longer knew what day it was. The sun never shone on Lesser Damantine. Time was measured in barrages. And still, Krendel came. His traitor legionnaires had pushed deeper into the outer sectors, their corpses clogging breach points, their shells hammering like war drums, each assault more furious than the last. Yet, they had not taken the inner bastion. The command keep still held, the phalanx batteries still roared, and Dantioch, broken, hated, exiled, still stood at its center, unrelenting. But even iron can shudder. On the 11th day, something changed. It began with a Vox anomaly, a faint blip, not a signal from Krendel, not part of the traitor's siege traffic. Something else. It flickered into existence across the encrypted Imperial channels, ones Dantioch hadn't used in years. At first, he dismissed it as noise, a rogue signal bouncing off the upper atmosphere, but then it came again. Louder, sharper, a single phrase spoken in High Gothic. "In the Emperor's light we find our purpose. Respond." He froze. That voice did not belong to the 4th Legion. It was clipped, formal, unmistakably precise. It was Ultramarine. He opened the channel, fed it through a filtration grid, ran it through every security cipher he still remembered. Then he heard it again. "I repeat, this is Tetrarch Tauro Nicodemus of the 13th Legion, loyal servant of Robute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines. I seek audience with the commander of this installation." Dantioch didn't answer immediately. Instead, he activated the perimeter auspex grid and scanned the terrain. The system flickered, half crippled from damage, but the return pings came through. One lone figure, approaching on foot. No armor convoy, no air support. Just a single space marine in cobalt blue plate walking across a war zone. The man walked with calm, deliberate purpose, as if the siege meant nothing. Bolter fire struck around him. He did not flinch. Shrapnel churned the ground at his heels. He continued. The Iron Warriors who saw him hesitated. Some raised weapons, others simply stared. Dantioch overrode the perimeter defenses before anyone could shoot. He stood at the top of the inner bastion, arms folded, gatebreaker at his side, and watched the blue-armored warrior draw closer. When the Ultramarine finally stood before the keep's blast door, Dantioch keyed the Vox personally. "You're a long way from Ultramar, son of Guilliman." "So are you, son of Perturabo," came the reply. "May I come in?" Dantioch hesitated. Then the blast doors hissed open. The Ultramarine stepped into the fortress, his armor caked in the ash and soot of Damantine's winds. His helm was clipped to his belt, revealing a face chiseled and calm, eyes that missed nothing. There was no fear in him, no arrogance, just focus. "Tetrarch Nicodemus," he said, bowing his head slightly. "Of the 27th Macraga cohort, I bring word from my Primarch." Dantioch said nothing. He simply turned and walked. The Ultramarine followed. They passed through the fortress together, past wounded iron warriors being tended by grim-faced serfs, past shattered turrets and half-collapsed catwalks, through flickering lights and the ever-present hum of active defenses. The defenders watched the Ultramarine with unreadable expressions, but no one raised a weapon. At last, they entered the strategium. Dantioch sat at the command table and gestured to the other side. "Speak." Nicodemus did. He spoke of Horus, of the War Master's betrayal, of Istvan Fee and the massacre of the loyal legions, of the Word-Bearer's atrocities at Calth, of the Ruin Storm, the warp phenomenon that had severed communication across the stars, of Guilliman's desperate efforts to hold the Eastern Imperium together, of Imperium Secundus, a last bastion in the face of chaos. Dantioch listened. He asked no questions. Not at first, but his silence was not apathy. It was fury, held in ironclad restraint. When the Tetrarch finished, Dantioch finally spoke. "Why come here? Why now? You've got 500 worlds to save. What use is one battered fortress on a backwater moon?" "Because it's holding," Nicodemus replied. "Because it shouldn't be, and because we need you." "I'm an Iron Warrior," Dantioch said flatly. "Or have you forgotten what that means?" "I know what you are," the Ultramarine said, "and I know what you're not. You're not his creature." There was silence between them. Heavy. Real. Nicodemus stepped closer, and for the first time, his voice cracked. Not with weakness, but with something that sounded like pleading. "Guilliman is planning something. He's building something new, but he can't do it alone. And right now, you are holding up an entire grand company of traitors. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I'm delaying the inevitable," Dantioch said. "It means you're giving us time," Nicodemus snapped. "Time that could save entire systems. Time that could hold back the tide. Time that Guilliman can use to stabilize the Eastern Fringe. You don't have to win, Dantioch. You just have to last." Dantioch sat in silence, staring into the glowing tactical display. The blue of Nicodemus's armor reflected off the metal of his mask. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of distant cannon fire. Then the Warsmith stood. "How many of my kind have turned?" "Most," Nicodemus said. "Not all, but most." "Then you understand what I'm doing by helping you?" "Yes." "Good." Dantioch turned to the Vox Grill. "Open the bastion. Give him access to the command relays. And prep a new comm link." "To whom?" "To Guilliman." Nicodemus allowed himself the briefest nod. They stood side by side then, looking over the burning terrain outside. Two sons of estranged fathers, one in cobalt, one in iron. For a moment, the centuries-old enmity between their legions meant nothing. There was only loyalty, only purpose. And in that moment, Dantioch made his choice. Not to serve a new master, not to join a new legion, but to protect the future from the mistakes of the past. Krendel had come to erase him. Guilliman had sent Nicodemus to redeem him. And in the cold twilight of Damantine, as shells screamed in the distance and the fortress groaned under pressure, Barabbas Dantioch quietly chose who he was. He was no longer Perturabo's son. He was the Emperor's. And the war, it seemed, was far from over. The deal was struck beneath burning skies, where the ash drifted down like snow and the blood of sons ran hot in the soil. Warsmith Dantioch stood at the edge of a ruined observation platform, arms folded behind his back, his cracked iron mask staring out over the pitted no-man's land. The faint strobe of distant gunfire pulsed like a heartbeat. In the near distance, the siege lines of the 14th Grand Company were etched into the horizon, crawling with movement, the dull glimmer of siege armor and marching figures swarming across a cratered battlefield. Every hour they came closer. Beside him stood Tetrarch Taro Nicodemus, arms crossed, his cobalt armor scorched and smeared with smoke, but pristine compared to the state of the fortress. He too watched the field in silence. There was no ceremony, no banner exchange or sigil-bearing honor guard. There were only two warriors, once enemies by birthright, bound now by necessity, staring into the teeth of the storm. Dantioch broke the silence first. They'll breach the northern gallery within 36 hours, maybe less. That section wasn't built to take sustained orbital fire. It was always the weak point, by design. Why design a weak point in your own fortress? Nicodemus asked, his voice tinged with curiosity, not criticism. So I could know exactly where they'd come, Dantioch said flatly. Where to draw them, where to punish them. It wasn't pride in his voice, it was preparation. The difference was important. Nicodemus said nothing further, simply filing that away as Ultramarines did, every word another stone in the wall of understanding. They were not friends. They would never be. But trust, like loyalty, can be forged under pressure, and the fires of Lesser Damantine were hotter than most. The days that followed were a blur of motion, steel, and strategy. With Dantioch's reluctant blessing, the Ultramarine was given full access to the command data stacks of the Schadenhold. Nicodemus walked its corridors not as a guest, but as a field commander. He spoke little to the Iron Warriors under Dantioch's command, but when he did, it was with clarity, efficiency, and a strange note of respect. Some of the mortal auxilia gave him wide berth. Others watched him with awe. It was the first time many of them had seen an Astartes of another legion, and not just another, one from the vaunted 13th. He coordinated a reorganization of the surviving human garrison into smaller fire teams, using Ultramarine-style command cells to plug gaps in the failing defensive grid. Dantioch watched him work from afar at first, noting the differences in doctrine, the minor deviations from what he considered clean fortification theory. But he did not intervene. The Ultramarines' changes worked. At times, they debated. Your defenses rely too heavily on static position holding, Nicodemus observed one night, standing over a grainy tactical projection. Your choke points are deadly, but once overrun, you give up ground permanently. No space to counterattack. Because I have no reinforcements, Tetrarch, Dantioch replied. This is not Calth. I cannot trade space for time. I hold every meter, or I hold nothing. That's a losing strategy. No, it's a delaying strategy. And so it went. Not quarrels, not conflict. Just two minds circling the same reality from different angles. The rigid mathematics of Perturabo's siegecraft clashed with Guilliman's adaptability. But somewhere between them, something new began to form, a hybrid of stubborn endurance and flexible response. On the 14th day of the siege, Grendel launched what should have been his breakthrough. Using breaching drills and seismic warheads, the traitor forces tore open 3 kilometers of the northern sector's trench line in a single coordinated strike. Dozens of defenders were vaporized instantly. A battle barge's lance battery sliced into the upper wall, collapsing its entire western third. The traitors surged forward, iron warriors in corrupted armor, demonic sigils glowing faintly on their shoulder plates, some flanked by grotesque cybernetic monstrosities grown from flesh and steel. They believed the fortress was falling, and that was precisely what Dantioch wanted them to think. As the outer wall buckled, hundreds of traitor legionnaires funneled into the breach. They advanced through rubble and fire, forming tight kill squads, confident that victory was at hand. But in the smoke-shrouded ruins, they missed the signs, the odd funneling of their own path, the way the debris led them not into the fortress proper, but downward into a section not marked on their maps. And then the walls closed behind them. Auto slabs of ceramite slammed into place, thermal mines embedded in the debris cooked off. Plasma vents ignited the air itself. From hidden apertures, last turrets emerged in crisscrossing formations, and worst of all, the ceiling detonated, pouring down 10,000 tons of liquefied ferrocrete that hardened almost instantly upon impact. The entire assault group was buried alive. Nicodemus watched from the upper battlements, arms folded, saying nothing. Dantioch stepped up beside him, smoke curling from his gauntlets. "They never understood," he said. "A fortress doesn't need to be impenetrable. It just needs to make you think it is." That night they held council. Only a few attended. Dantioch, Nicodemus, Morian, the Iron Warrior lieutenant who had stood by Dantioch since the earliest days, and two mortal commanders, one a grim-faced Macrovault officer named Sarat, the other a cybernetically enhanced Vox specialist who had no tongue but communicated through blinking glyphs. They met in a fortified chamber beneath the keep's foundation, walls layered in psychic shielding and nullite mesh. The war map flickered between sectors, showing damage indicators and casualty tallies in slow rotation. None of it was good. They had lost a third of the fortress. Over 60% of the garrison was dead or too wounded to fight. "We can't hold forever," Morian said. "They're learning. Each attack gets closer. Our traps are killing fewer. They're adapting. They'll keep coming until we fall," Sarat agreed. "The question is when." "No," Nicodemus said. "The question is how long you can still bleed them." That made them pause. The Ultramarine stepped forward, gesturing toward the display. "The longer this fortress holds, the more time it gives us. My fleet is gone. Guilliman is isolated. We need this delay. Dantioch, I need you to keep them here." "You want me to die on purpose?" Dantioch said, his voice flat. "No," Nicodemus said. "I want you to make this place so costly that Krendel has no fleet left to take with him. I want you to drain him. Until we break." "Yes." Silence fell again. And then Dantioch nodded. "Then we do it properly. No last stand, no desperate charge. We turn this place into a mire. They will choke on our bones." The next days were different. The defenses became more mobile. Kill squads patrolled wrecked corridors, flanking traitors before retreating into darkness. Plasma coils were reconfigured to pulse intermittently, luring attackers into ambush zones. Mortar rounds were wired with signal mimickers to simulate reinforcements arriving. Entire levels were flooded with psychotropic gas harvested from damaged mechanicum stockpiles, driving invading units into frenzy and confusion. Nicodemus watched with grim respect. This was no longer a siege, it was a crucible, and Dantioch stood at its center, masked, burning with purpose. On the 19th day, a traitor Iron Warrior broke through the lines and reached the inner keep. He was wounded, staggering, helmetless. A veteran, his armor etched with Olympia's emblems, a once proud son now twisted by war and belief. He found Dantioch alone, overseeing the repair of a power junction. The traitor raised his weapon but hesitated. "Barabbas," he rasped, "you're supposed to be dead." "I am," Dantioch said. "Now leave this place. We were brothers. We still are. That's why I'm warning you. Turn back. This fortress doesn't end with victory." The traitor said nothing. Then he pulled the trigger. Dantioch stepped aside lightning fast and brought Gatebreaker around with a single brutal arc. The hammer crushed his former brother's chest, caving in ceramite and ribcage alike. No malice, no rage, just necessity. As he stood over the corpse, Nicodemus arrived, flanked by Morian. "How long can we last?" the Ultramarine asked quietly. "I don't know," Dantioch admitted, "but long enough." He turned back toward the heart of the fortress, toward the final phase of his stand. "We'll hold. Let them come. Every shell, every drop of blood, every scream. We'll make this their graveyard. For Guilliman, for the Emperor," Dantioch said, "and for the truth." The pact was made, iron and blue, ash and oath. And the fortress roared again. By the 22nd day, the Schadenhold had gone quiet. Not silent, never silent. The distant rumble of artillery still echoed through the stone foundations, and the groaning shriek of stressed bulkheads still reverberated in the lower levels. But the once constant rhythm of bolter fire, the chaos of overlapping alarms, the barked orders, the desperate footfalls of wounded men, those had faded. It was the kind of quiet that only came when everyone still alive was waiting to die. Dantioch stood alone in the substation tunnels, beneath what had once been Section 14 of the upper defenses. Above, the sector had been utterly pulverized by Krendel's siege batteries, a cluster of rotary cannons known as Ramscourge that ground down enemy fortifications with relentless pressure, like teeth chewing through bone. There had been a barracks there. Now it was gone. 50 men lost in seconds. Dantioch hadn't spoken at the Vox funeral. He'd simply turned away and walked down here, to the veins of the fortress, where the geothermal pumps hissed and the walls sweated condensation. Alone. The heat didn't bother him, nor the pressure. In a way, it reminded him of Olympia. The underforts of his birth world had been dark, tight places, with vented steam and black stone ceilings, where sons of Perturabo learned geometry and war beneath the sound of tectonic groans. He traced his hand along the wall. A rough patch of stone jutted from the otherwise uniform tunnel. A repair made under pressure, imperfect, unaesthetic. He made a note to fix it, though he knew he likely never would. The war above continued. Krendel's forces had changed tactics again. No more mass charges, no more grand sieges. They had shifted to infiltration. Saboteur teams, vent crawlers, void-suited scouts dropped from low-orbit shuttles into the upper spires, cutting through airlocks and slipping inside like carrion crows. Dantioch had anticipated it. He had always known Krendel would try this. The method was pure Iron Warrior, adaptation through necessity. When the walls wouldn't break, you slithered through the cracks. What Krendel hadn't expected was that Dantioch would make the cracks bleed. In the second auxiliary shaft, beneath the collapsed north wall, an infiltration team entered on the 24th night. 6 traitor Iron Warriors, veteran saboteurs. Their armor was blackened and covered in sealing resin. Their weapons were suppressed, their movements near silent. They had trained for this on the orbital hulks of the War Master's fleet, in mock-ups of Dantioch's own fortress, built from captured scans. They never saw the first one die. The rear scout stepped forward, triggering a pressure plate hidden under what appeared to be a damaged steel grate. His armor locked up as neurovenom flooded his body through a timed microburst gas canister. He convulsed for less than 3 seconds before collapsing. The others didn't halt. They moved on. But the tunnel began to shift. The walls themselves hissed open, and from alcoves barely wide enough for a man's arm, Autocarbines hidden behind blast shields opened fire. The hallway became a corridor of fire. 4 died there. The last one made it to the inner pump station, a tech marine, a skilled one by the look of him. He reached for the main vent override, likely aiming to destabilize the fortress's geothermal cooling. He was still reaching when a thunderhammer crashed down from above, shattering his spine and burying him in a pool of his own ichor. Dantioch stepped back from the corpse. No ceremony, no anger, just confirmation. They were getting bolder. Nicodemus was waiting in the command keep when Dantioch returned. He was standing over a data slab, reviewing casualty lists with the grim patience of a man who had long since accepted that he couldn't save everyone. His armor was scraped and dented, his right pauldron bearing a long gouge from a close encounter with a traitor's chain blade. Dantioch said nothing about it. "They're trying the vents again," the Warsmith said. "I'm starting to think they know where we sleep." "Then it's time we stopped sleeping," Nicodemus replied. "We rotate command watches every 4 hours. I'll take the next." "You haven't slept in 3 days. Neither have you." They didn't smile. Ultramarines and Iron Warriors didn't trade jokes like that. But in the silence that followed, there was a kind of acknowledgement, an understanding. Shared suffering forged respect, if not camaraderie. "We're down to 700 effectives," Dantioch continued, "and half of those are barely standing. We'll make do. It won't be enough." "It never is," Nicodemus said, "but that's not the point, is it?" Dantioch looked up sharply. "Number, it's not." That night, Dantioch walked the inner barracks for the first time in days. He made no announcement. He simply appeared, ghost-like, among the wounded and the weary. He passed a group of mortal troopers, what remained of the Damantine Auxilia. They sat hunched on crates, weapons across their laps, eyes hollow. One of them, a young woman missing her right arm below the elbow, looked up and nodded once. Dantioch returned it. That was all. In the Astartes Medicae ward, he paused at the side of a wounded Iron Warrior, armor torn open, chest held together by surgical tape and willpower. The warrior looked up. "They said we'd all turn," he said. "Said the warp would call to us. But it didn't." "No," Dantioch said quietly. "It never did. Why us?" "Because we didn't lie to ourselves about what loyalty meant." The warrior closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. By the 26th day, Dantioch began to reconfigure the inner fortress entirely. He gave orders to collapse tertiary supply vaults and rewire energy grids through auxiliary subsystems. He directed power reroutes so precise they could only have come from the mind of a builder who knew every brick of the fortress like a heartbeat. "We're not holding ground anymore," he told Nicodemus. "We're holding time. Every minute we delay them, we buy something. Maybe nothing we'll ever see, but something." "Then let's bleed the clocks dry," the Ultramarine answered. On the 27th night, the vents screamed again. This time it was Krendel himself, or at least his voice. It came across all channels at once, overriding encryption, flooding through the fortress like a whispered plague. "Barabbas, enough of this charade. Your fortress dies by inches. Your allies falter. I've seen the bodies. How long do you think you can pretend this is anything but defeat?" Dantioch didn't respond. He let the silence answer. But Nicodemus did. "You're right, traitor. This is defeat, but it's yours. We've held you here for almost a month. You've burned men, ships, and pride just to claw through one dead man's walls. You'll get inside eventually, but when you do, there'll be nothing left for you. No spoils, no triumph, only ghosts and broken guns. That's the only victory we offer you." When the Vox fell silent, Dantioch smiled beneath the mask. Just a little. He turned to his Ultramarine companion. The only loyalist in blue he'd ever trusted. The next phase begins tomorrow. We let them in. You're certain? Yes, let them taste victory. He stared at the fortress's master schematic one last time. Then, with hands steadier than they should have been, he began to seal the final routes, collapse the last chambers, channel the blood to where it would be seen. Let Krendel take the fortress. Let him walk into a mausoleum, and then bury him in the bones. The fortress did not fall. It was opened. On the dawn of the 28th day, the sky above Lesser Damantine was a canvas of fire and choking dust. The sun was nothing but a dim disk behind endless strata of soot, and the air shimmered with heat from energy discharge and chemical fires. In the distance, the siege engines of the 14th Grand Company thundered in victorious cadence. The long war, they believed, was ending. At last, the Schadenhold had yielded. Its gates, those mighty slabs of reinforced ceramite layered with cyclonic shielding, did not explode outward. They groaned open, slowly, deliberately, as if some ancient colossus had sighed and, at last, given in to the inevitable. No booby traps triggered, no plasma mines detonated, no firestorms lashed the entry teams. The traitor Iron Warriors moved in formation, cautious but confident. They were led by Warsmith Krendel himself, encased in ornate battle plate lined with warp-forged filigree and black gold trim. A great siege hammer rested in his grip, no less brutal than the traditional tools of their legion, but adorned now with unholy runes that pulsed and squirmed when left in shadow. Behind Krendel followed his veterans, all once loyal sons of Olympia, now twisted by allegiance to Perturabo's new doctrine, devotion not to strategy or unity, but to bitterness, entropy, and the cruel arithmetic of damnation. Krendel did not speak as they crossed the threshold of the Schadenhold. He simply walked, one step at a time, deeper into the enemy stronghold, breathing in the scent of scorched dust and silence. Inside, they encountered no resistance. Not at first. The outer corridors were abandoned, half-ruined. Lights flickered. Bulkheads hung ajar. Signs of battle were everywhere. Melted steel, blood sprays, scorched plating. But no corpses, no defenders. Just empty halls, stretching deep into the fortress's darkened belly. Still, Krendel was no fool. He advanced methodically, using augury scans, spreading his forces into overlapping phalanxes, searching for traps. He found none. No mines, no motion sensors, no signal loops. It was as if the fortress had decided to die. And so Krendel advanced. At his side walked his second-in-command, a bitter iron captain named Rethan. His voice graveled from years of rebreather use. "It's too quiet," Rethan muttered. "Of course it is," Krendel replied. "It's Dantioch. This is the last misdirection. He's trying to draw us into a kill box. Should we pull back? No. We don't retreat from ghosts. Let him haunt us if he dares." The irony, though Krendel did not yet know it, was that he was half right. It wasn't a kill box they were entering. It was a mausoleum. In the deepest sector of the Schadenhold, the primary reactor chamber, a console flickered to life. No alarms sounded, no sirens blared, just a series of data feeds running silently across the screen, observed by a single figure. Warsmith Dantioch stood in the shadows, watching the progression of Krendel's forces through the fortress via hardwired surveillance nodes. His armor was caked in soot, his servo plate cracked in 3 places, and his thunder hammer rested against the wall beside him. His iron mask, ever present, was smeared with blood. Whether his or another's, he no longer cared. Behind him stood Nicodemus, the Ultramarine tetrarch, clad in cracked cobalt blue, sword drawn but relaxed. His shoulder was wrapped in a pressure-sealed tourniquet, a souvenir from the last vent incursion. Neither of them spoke at first. They just watched. "They've taken the bait," Nicodemus said at last. "Of course they have," Dantioch replied, tone unreadable. "They've forgotten what it means to think like a defender." "And what does it mean?" "It means you never fight where they expect you to. You make them fight where they want to. You let them have what they think they've earned, then you remind them why they didn't want it in the first place." Krendel's forces pressed onward. They reached the Hall of Echoes, an immense transit chamber once used to marshal armored columns. Its walls were carved from volcanic stone, reinforced with adamantine crossbeams. A cavern of military majesty, now strewn with shattered vehicles and ruined lifter pads. Still no defenders, until the doors closed. With a shuddering groan, massive blast doors sealed shut behind them, each locking with magnetic bolts keyed to Dantioch's own Vox signature. Then from above, the first voice in hours echoed through the hall. "Welcome to my grave," Dantioch's voice rasped through the speaker arrays. "I'm glad you could join me," Krendel snarled. "Dantioch, enough games. You're standing in a pressure-locked chamber rigged to ignite. Do you know how many corpses I had to bury beneath your boots to make this moment work? How many hours spent sealing halls, cutting off paths, laying the wires? You wanted this fortress. Now you've got it. Do it then," Krendel growled. "You don't have the will to take us all with you." There was a long pause. "No," Dantioch finally said. "I don't. That's why I'm not here." At that moment, 6 concealed doors along the upper reaches of the chamber burst open. From them poured fire, pure promethium, lit with magnesium ignition. The inferno swept down in twin arcs, catching the rear elements of Krendel's force before they could react. The heat flash-cooked flesh in an instant. Astartes screamed, not in fear, but in fury and confusion. And then the walls moved, literally. Dantioch's final trick, sliding bulkheads fashioned from reinforced plating, dropped from concealed recesses, dividing the Hall of Echoes into segments. Krendel's warriors were now separated, isolated into fire cages, trapped without line of sight or overlapping fire arcs. In one segment, traitor iron warriors hammered against the barriers. In another, Dantioch's garrison, his remaining iron warriors, human militia, and even a handful of Mechanicum tech thralls emerged from hidden compartments and maintenance tunnels, launching a brutal close-quarters assault. Bolters flared, chain swords shrieked, blood sprayed in every direction. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Nicodemus led a team through the collapsed south tunnel, flanking the main kill zone. His blade danced in tight arcs, slicing through corrupted Astartes plate with surgical precision. The Ultramarine moved like a ghost in cobalt steel, his eyes aflame with purpose. "For Calth," someone shouted. "No," Nicodemus snapped back. "For now. For this." Dantioch entered from the north, Gatebreaker swinging with the force of an artillery strike. One traitor marine moved to block him, then vanished beneath a blow that caved in armor and floor alike. Dantioch did not pause. He kept moving, hammer in hand, like a force of inevitability. Krendel watched it all happen from the central dais of the chamber, smoke rising around him. His forces were collapsing, not from superior numbers, but from betrayal, from having been outthought, from having been seen for exactly what they were, arrogant sons of a blind father. "Dantioch," he bellowed, "face me." And so Dantioch came. He stepped onto the dais, broken armor still steaming, helm cracked further down the side. His hammer was scorched black. His posture was that of a dying man, but one who had decided to take as many with him as possible. "You shouldn't have come here, Krendel," Dantioch said. "Not because of the guns, not because of the traps, but because I remember who you were, and you don't. I serve the truth now, Krendel spat. Perturabo's truth. You betrayed it. No, Dantioch said quietly. I survived it. They charged. The hammer and the axe met in a clash that shattered the stone beneath them. Each blow was a memory, each parry a scream swallowed by years of silence. The duel lasted less than a minute. And when it ended, Krendel fell, his helm shattered, his chest plate caved in, the spark of his corrupted soul flickering in the back of his eyes. This is your grave, Dantioch whispered to him. You just never knew it. Outside the fortress, the remaining traitor forces, leaderless and reeling, began to fall back. Some died in the trenches. Others tried to flee into the wastelands of Damantine. A few escaped into orbit, but the fortress, even in ruin, had claimed its toll. Nicodemus and Dantioch stood once more on the upper ramparts, bloodied and silent. Is it over? Nicodemus asked. No, Dantioch replied, but they'll remember this, the grave they chose. And far above them, the stars watched without blinking, cold, distant, and perhaps just a little brighter. The siege was broken, but the fortress had died. Not in body. Those walls, though gutted and cracked, still stood. The bastions still bore the scars of defiant artillery. The ramparts still ringed the shattered keep like jagged teeth. But the soul of the Schadenhold, its function, its identity, had burned away in the crucible of its final stand. The enemy was gone. The 14th Grand Company, or what remained of it, had retreated to the void. Krendel was dead. The siege engines were silent. The orbital bombardments had ceased. Yet within the keep, silence reigned not with peace, but with exhaustion. Dantioch stood in the Hall of Echoes once more. But now there were no enemies to entrap, no warriors to slay. The bulkheads he had lowered to create kill cages had been lifted. The debris had been cleared by the few remaining tech servitors, still able to function. The fire-blackened walls were bare again. Only the bloodstains remained. He stood in the center, surrounded by nothing. His hammer, Gatebreaker, was propped beside him, the haft cracked and wrapped in torn ceramite cloth. His armor had been patched hastily with sealant and scrap metal. His left shoulder still seeped fluid from a rent in the suit. And yet he did not fall. He did not rest. Because the work was not done. Elsewhere, in the infirmary, what passed for healing was underway. Nicodemus moved among the wounded. He bore no rank here, no command. He was simply present, helping, bandaging a fallen auxilia with one hand while relaying tactical reports with the other. No fanfare, no demands. The men, Imperial and Astartes alike, had stopped calling him the Ultramarine. Now, when they referred to him, they simply said the Tetrarch. They did not know what the word meant, but they felt its weight. In the hours after the final battle, Dantioch had made no victory speech, no declaration, no ceremony. He had simply gathered what remained of the command staff, what little there was left of it, and informed them of the next reality. We will not rebuild the Schadenhold, he had said, his voice like gravel across a metal plate. We cannot. We have neither the strength nor the time, and even if we could, there is no point. The war has moved on. This place has served its purpose. None had argued. How could they? Of the thousands who once filled the fortress's halls, only a few hundred remained. The forge halls had collapsed. The primary reactors were venting dangerously. The defenses had been spent like coin in the fire. And worst of all, the beacon was dead. Nicodemus stood now at its base. The Pharos array, once a marvel of repurposed Xenos science, was cold, silent. Its light had flared briefly during the final stand, activated by Dantioch as a desperate threat. a bluff against Krendel's forces. But that final surge had burned out the empathic relays. The core was gone. The damage was not structural, it was conceptual. The beacon had willed itself to rest. "It's sleeping," Dantioch said quietly behind him. "I thought it was destroyed." "Not destroyed, but we can't wake it again. Not here, not now. So Ultramar is cut off. Not forever, but for now, yes." They stood together in that ruined chamber a long time. The stone felt heavier now, the silence more oppressive. And in that silence, the Tetrarch finally asked what had been lingering since the siege ended. "What now, Dantioch?" The Warsmith didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked around the console. His steps echoed, metal on metal. At the base of the beacon's tower, he reached down and retrieved a small data slate, half buried in ash. He wiped it clean with the edge of his palm. "This," he said, holding it up, "contains every diagram I ever created for the Shadenhold. Every layer, every power grid, every alternate entrance, every kill field, every structural shift. I made it not just to preserve what I built, but to teach someone else how to build better. Who will you give it to? Someone who will still be alive when this war ends." They left the tower in silence, no words, only understanding. In the outer barracks, a small group of surviving mortal guardsmen stood in loose formation. Many were bandaged, a few were missing limbs, but they stood tall. Among them, an aging officer named Vorex saluted as Dantioch approached. "They're waiting, sir," he said. "For what?" "For orders, for direction, for purpose." Dantioch regarded them in silence, the same way he might study a shattered wall or a breached turret. "There's no more fortress," he said, "but there's still a war. You want purpose? You'll find it in every world still under siege, in every family hiding in bunkers, in every fleet running low on fuel while traitors hunt them. I can't give you a home, but I can give you something to do." "Where do we go?" Vorex asked. "Wherever they need a wall between them and the abyss." And the men nodded. Later, Dantioch and Nicodemus stood outside the outer gates. The wind had picked up again, scouring the barren plains with fine iron dust. In the distance, the horizon shimmered under a smog-choked sun. The remains of Krendel's fleet had long since vanished into warp trails, fleeing the scene of their humiliation. "They'll regroup," Nicodemus said. "Of course they will," Dantioch answered. "But not here. And us? We don't stay either. You're leaving the Shadenhold. I buried too many good men in its foundations. It's a tomb now. No point defending ghosts." From above, the fortress seemed to breathe its last. Damaged heat stacks vented one final plume. Auto turrets hung limp and lifeless. The signal relay tower flickered once, then died. Lesser Damantine, a world once considered strategically useless, had become a legend, and now a memory. Dantioch gave the order. "Evacuate all personnel, strip everything useful, leave the rest." "To whom?" Nicodemus asked. "To time." In the final hours before the last shuttle rose from the surface, Dantioch took one final walk through the fortress. He passed the places where his iron warriors had made their last stands, the rooms where his mortal auxilia had refused to flee, the blood-stained corridor where he had broken Krendel's hammer and his will, the forge chamber where he had, decades ago, forged the first plates of Gatebreaker. He walked with no escort, no ceremony. At the central vault, he stopped. He reached up and removed his iron mask, the first time in years. No one was there to see what lay beneath. That was how he wanted it. He placed the mask on the vault's altar, turned, and walked away. The final transmission from Lesser Damantine was a simple burst. One phrase encrypted and relayed to Ultramar via surviving astropathic corridors. The wall held. And then Barabbas Dantioch, the warsmith without a legion, the loyalist without a home, stepped into the dark beyond his fortress's shadow and became once more a sword in the hand of fate. He did not look back. The warp takes everything. It doesn't simply drag ships into the tides of unreality or scour minds with its impossible tides. It robs you of certainty, of rhythm, of cause and effect. A second becomes an hour, a year becomes a heartbeat. The soul frays in ways the flesh cannot follow, and for those who travel its hellish arteries, survival is not just a triumph of engineering, it is a war of will. Barabbas Dantioch, clad in the cracked and scarred remnants of his warplate, sat alone in the dark chamber of a small, ancient warp-capable craft known only by its registry code, Reliquary Redoubt 7. It was a relic ship, gifted to him by the Mechanicum decades ago, never used, kept in reserve for some final distant war. Now he sailed it not toward war, but toward purpose. The departure from Lesser Damantine had not been dramatic. There were no final salutes, no banners raised, only the slow and silent lift of battered shuttles and landers, carrying survivors up into the thin atmosphere, guided by blinking guidance beacons and prayer. Dantioch had not flown with the others. He had waited until the last transport had disappeared from view, until the very dust seemed to settle into morning. Then he activated the warp drives. No astropath rode aboard his vessel, no navigator. The ship was guided by coordinates pre-programmed into its systems, numbers provided to him by Tetrarch Nicodemus, scrawled in his own hand and sealed in an honor-bound file keyed to Dantioch's gene code. A destination, the Pharos, the real one, not the repurposed fragment that had guided refugees and defied the ruin storm from the depths of the Schadenhold. This was the true mountain, the world of Sotha. Dantioch had never been there, but now he would see it with his own eyes. The warp boiled around the ship. The interior lights flickered. Spectral forms coiled in the corners of his vision, shadows that seemed to watch without shape. Echoes from the ruin of Damantine haunted his thoughts. The broken battlements, the torn banners, the voices of the dead calling out in his dreams. But Barabbas Dantioch did not fear ghosts. He had lived among them too long. He had built fortresses for the dead. He passed his time in the void not by meditating or sleeping, but by studying. Laid across the workbench before him were the blueprints for the Pharos relay tower, Xenos in origin, encrypted with machine language that had driven lesser minds mad. But Dantioch did not blink. The patterns made sense to him. Not all at once, but in a slow, grinding way, like a fortress slowly being excavated beneath a mountain of rubble. This device was not built to signal, he muttered aloud, voice rasping through dry lips. It was built to bind. A transmission platform? Perhaps, but it was more than that. The more he examined it, the more he understood. Pharos was never meant to merely guide ships through the warp. It was designed to connect minds, a psychic anchor, amplifying thoughts across void and unreality alike. And that realization chilled even him. The warp began to churn harder. Time twisted, lights dimmed. The ship shook as something vast passed too close, a shape not visible but felt, its presence like pressure behind the eyes and needles beneath the tongue. Dantioch gripped the sides of the command throne. He did not pray. He did not scream. He simply endured. Iron within, iron without. Eventually, the storm passed. When real space bled back into focus and the stars returned to proper alignment, Dantioch opened his eyes and saw it for the first time. Sotha. It was not a world of grandeur, not at first glance. Its surface was mostly green, with large oceans and scattered mountain chains. But as the ship descended into orbit, a strange stillness settled over him. This was not just another world. In the northern hemisphere, nestled in a continent wreathed by thick cloud cover, there stood a mountain unlike any other. It pierced the sky like a blade, black against the starlight. It had no summit. It simply vanished into the atmosphere, and at its base, like a slumbering god, was the Pharos. The landing was simple. The reliquary redoubt touched down on a barren rock shelf beside the mountain's base. No defenders greeted him. No fortifications were active. The site had been stripped of its old garrisons. Only silent ruins remained, hollow bastions bearing the heraldry of the 13th Legion, now faded to dull blue and gray. Dantioch walked alone. He passed fallen banners, dismantled vox towers, corpses turned to ash and bone beneath rusting armor. There had been a battle here, though not recent. The walls bore scars not from siege, but from within. Panic, sabotage, betrayal, and all paths led upward, into the mountain's core. The Pharos itself waited in silence. As he stepped into its perimeter, the ground seemed to hum. Not loud, not threatening. More like the breath of a sleeping titan. The great doors were sealed, but Dantioch laid his hand upon them, and they opened. Not by code, not by key, but by recognition. He descended into the heart of the mountain. Inside, the structure shifted. Gone were the signs of Imperial architecture. No cogitators, no hapstacks, no servo torches. The walls were seamless black stone, lined with veins of faintly glowing silver. Symbols glimmered beneath the surface, alien, yet geometric. Familiar to his mind, if not his memory, he passed between them like a priest entering a sacred text. And there, in the core, he found it. The heart of the beacon, a spire of crystalline matrix suspended in magnetic fields, surrounded by concentric rings of floating stone and light. It pulsed, not with sound, but with thought. And it spoke, not in words, not in sentences, but in feelings, in impressions, in the pressure behind the eyes that meant awareness. It was a presence, neither machine nor demon, but something else, something that had been waiting. It did not ask who he was, it already knew. It welcomed him. Dantioch fell to one knee, not in reverence, but in exhaustion. For the first time in years, he let the silence hold him. He felt the presence reach toward him, not invading, not commanding, just listening. "You were never meant to be here," Dantioch whispered, "but here you are." And in that communion he understood something more. The Pharos had not been repurposed by Guilliman's forces. It had allowed itself to be used. It had chosen. And now it had chosen him. For hours or days or moments, he couldn't say, Dantioch remained in the beacon's presence, exchanging memory for understanding, offering pain in return for direction. He saw visions, not of the past, but of possibilities. Entire fleets drifting through the void, cut off, dying, civilizations collapsing into warp storms, and one point of light, a flicker in the chaos, the mountain of Sotha, beating like a heart. It showed him Ultramar, it showed him Terra, it showed him what could be preserved. When he emerged from the Pharos, his mind felt scorched but steady. He did not speak of what he had seen. He simply walked back to his ship, recalibrated its drives, and prepared for departure. His mission was no longer survival. It was connection. The Pharos had given him more than vision. It had shown him what he could become, not just a bulwark, but a bridge, a keeper of light in the long dark. Not a warsmith, a watcher. As the reliquary redoubt lifted from Sotha's surface and slipped once more into the veil of stars, Dantioch looked back at the world beneath him. He did not weep. He did not smile. He only said one thing, quietly to no one. "We are not finished. To those who dwell beneath the banners of Ultramar, Macragge is more than a world. It is a symbol, a citadel of honor, of discipline, of the doctrine that order and reason can defy even the madness of the galaxy. And for centuries its skies had been clear, its gates unbroken. But in the days after the ruined storm's birth and the sundering of the Imperium, even Macragge could not stand untouched. The sky was black when Dantioch arrived. The reliquary redoubt cut through the atmosphere like a dagger through silk, its heat shields glowing, its hull rattling from the friction of re-entry. The ship was not fast, nor was it well armed, but it was old, trusted, and hers was a name few remembered and none could track. That made her the perfect ghost. Warhammer Dantioch stood on the bridge as the world of Macragge rose before him. Snow-capped mountain ranges wrapped around fortress cities like steel nests. Valleys of cultivated precision bore the unmistakable design of the 13th Legion, logic in geometry, order in all things. But as he scanned the surface, he saw the signs of deeper strain. Pylons cracked by impact, Vox relays reconfigured to loop messages back into local systems, blockades at planetary approach vectors, manned by warships that bore no heraldry save plain ultramarine blue. The fortress world was still standing, but it was watching, and it did not trust. They did not greet him as a friend. A flight of stormbirds intercepted his vessel within minutes of atmospheric descent. Their Vox transmission was brief, terse, unmistakable. "Identify yourself or be annihilated." Dantioch gave his name without pride, no rank, no titles, just the truth. "This is Warhammer Dantioch, loyalist Iron Warrior. I come bearing transmission from Sotha. I request audience with Lord Guilliman." There was a pause, static cracked like frost in the line. Then, "Prepare to be boarded." The Ultramarines that entered his ship did so like surgeons entering a quarantined ward, alert, professional, silent. 10 of them, clad in Mark 7 armor with the Aquila freshly carved into the breastplates. Their sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Xison, did not lower his weapon as he scanned Dantioch's faceplate. "You don't look like a savior," Xison said. "I'm not," Dantioch replied. "Just a man with a message." He handed them the data capsule. He was escorted to the surface, not as a prisoner, but not as a guest. No chains bound his wrists, but none smiled as he passed. The fortress monastery of Macragge was as cold and silent as its mountains. In the halls where banners once danced in celebration, now only the boots of watchful soldiers echoed. They had survived too long to trust anyone. In a marble chamber known as the Hall of Adjudicators, Dantioch stood alone before a sealed adamantium door. He had not removed his helmet, he had not spoken a word since disembarking, but within him a storm brewed. The last time he had stood before a Primarch, it had been Perturabo. The words of that meeting still rang like iron in his memory. "You failed. You endured failure. That is not strength. It is weakness that has learned to kneel. But this time would be different." The door opened. Robauti Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord of the 500 Worlds, stepped into view not with a parade of warriors or the fanfare of command, but alone. He wore no helm. His armor gleamed with restrained brilliance, a practical majesty, and his face, stern, yes, but unscarred by bitterness, held the weight of every burden carried in silence. Dantioch removed his own helmet, slowly. Their eyes met. For a moment, there was nothing between them but memory. One the son of a father who had forsaken the Imperium for vengeance. The other, a son still fighting to preserve what could be salvaged from its ruin. "Warsmith Dantioch," Guilliman said, his voice calm, measured, layered with the ghost of sorrow. You were not expected. No, Dantioch said. I rarely am, but I've come regardless. I read your report. What you did on Damantine. Guilliman paused. Few loyal sons have accomplished as much under less favorable conditions. I didn't do it for honor. No, that's why it matters. Guilliman led him deeper into the chamber. No guards followed. They sat, Primarch and Warsmith, across from one another in a chamber built for councils, now used for confessions. The Pharaohs responded to you, Guilliman said. That should not be possible. And yet it was. You are not psychic. No, but I understand structure, purpose, connection. I felt its shape even if I didn't hear its song. And what did it tell you? That time is running out, and that we cannot wait for hope to come to us. Guilliman studied him with the eyes of a strategist, but not a cold one. There was a flicker of something like trust. There's something I must ask you, Dantioch, he said. Not as a general, as a builder. Ask, how do you build when the foundation is already cracked? When the ground shifts beneath your feet and every wall may turn traitor? Dantioch thought for a long moment. You build smaller, stronger. You make the foundation part of the wall. You accept that what came before is broken, and you make something new out of what remains. Even if it fails, especially then. There was silence between them again. But now it was not the silence of judgment. It was the pause before construction. In the days that followed, Dantioch remained on Macraga, not as a soldier, not even as a commander, but as a consultant, an advisor. He did not walk the parade fields. He did not address the recruits. Instead, he was seen most often in the subterranean vaults, poring over data feeds, reworking power flow schematics, arguing with Mechanicum adepts about psychic flux shielding and Xenos lattice reinforcement. He helped them rebuild the Pharaoh's interface relays. He advised on how to fortify the new fortress monasteries being constructed in the shadow of the ruin storm. And most critically, he helped bridge minds. Not with psionics, with understanding. One day, while walking the outer observation platform of Guilliman's fortress, Dantioch was approached by a young Ultramarine aspirant. The boy couldn't have been older than 20 Terran years, his armor barely out of the forge. Warsmith? The youth asked hesitantly. Just Dantioch, he said. Is it true, the boy continued, that you fought your own legion? Dantioch looked at him, then past him toward the cold horizon. No, he said, I fought what they became, and I still am. Because war for Barabbas Dantioch was never about hatred. It was about resistance, about the stubborn, unrelenting act of choosing to hold when everything else fell. And now, within the heart of the 13th Legion's domain, a fortress without a legion was helping rebuild a future that had almost died in shadow. And though he would never again be called Warsmith, he would always be remembered as something rarer. A loyal son of a traitor's blood, a builder of hope, a ghost that never stopped defending the living. In times of collapse, there are two kinds of men. Those who dig deeper into the ruin, hoping to find shelter beneath the weight of what fell, and those who plant something in the ashes, not knowing if it will ever grow. Barabbas Dantioch had been the first kind once, a builder of stone, a master of defense, a man who believed that if a wall was thick enough, high enough, patient enough, it could stop the end of the world. But the walls had fallen. Golgis, Olympia, even Damantine, though it bled its enemies dry, had not endured as he had meant it to. What endured was the idea of defense, the act of standing. And now, in a strange turn of fate, he found himself helping to grow something new, something unarmored, unfortified, vulnerable. something living. The fortress temples of Macraga still loomed, but Guilliman's eyes were turned now to Sotha. The Pharos beacon, repaired, rekindled by the labor of Ultramarines and Mechanicum both, had become more than a navigational tool. It was a lighthouse, yes, but also a hub, a root system. Guilliman envisioned a network of stability, a spine of civilization in the dark void, with the Pharos at its core. To Dantioch's mind, it was a logical move. You could not guard the galaxy by scattering fortresses at random. You needed order, cohesion, connectivity. But what disturbed him, what unsettled the Warsmith's carefully tempered soul, was the name Guilliman had given to his new venture. He called it a garden. "You mean to raise warriors like crops?" Dantioch had asked him once, gazing across a hololithic map that displayed settlements, relay points, satellite bastions surrounding Sotha. "Not warriors," Guilliman had replied. "Something more than that. We're not just trying to survive anymore. We're trying to restore, to regrow what was lost. I need this world to become a seed, not a wall." "Then you're asking me to build without shields?" "No, Dantioch. I'm asking you to build trust." That had silenced him. Trust. It was a word Dantioch had not used in decades, a word he had not felt in centuries. And yet, despite his discomfort, he remained. Weeks passed, perhaps months. The calendar had lost meaning amid the shifting demands of reconstruction, relay tests, and the persistent ripple of warp storm interference. Dantioch had taken residence in one of the relay outposts under construction, designated Pharos Substation 9. Unlike the high spires of Macraga, this was a place of earth and steel, function over grandeur, a humble series of structures that bristled with comm arrays and astropathic shielding, nestled at the foot of the Pharos mountain. The architects had left it as an auxiliary station. Dantioch turned it into a command hub. He rerouted power grids, restructured communication relays, installed thermal dampeners to prevent signature detection from orbit. Every improvement was quiet, subtle, invisible, unless you knew to look. He was not building a bastion. He was seeding resilience. It was during one of the long calibration nights that she arrived. A young woman clad not in armor but in a deep blue robe marked with the sigil of the Lexicanarchy. Her name was Callus Venthrol, an astropath of Guilliman's new command structure. She had come to deliver an encrypted packet directly to Dantioch, by hand. "Security protocol," she said when he asked why the data hadn't been transmitted. "Some things you don't risk the void with. And I'm one of them? You're the stone they're building on. Stones don't move, do they?" Dantioch didn't reply. He simply accepted the data slate and turned to leave. But before he stepped through the hatch, she said something else. "You're not what I expected." "No," he replied without turning. "I never am." The report she brought was strange. It spoke of new contacts from outside the ruin storm, of fleets that had navigated its shifting tides using faint pulses from the Pharos, of broken worlds who had rebuilt because they'd heard someone was still holding on, of rumors, faint, whispered, heretical, that a loyal Iron Warrior had been seen walking the halls of Ultramar. Dantioch read the report 3 times. Then he stood up and walked to the outer landing platform, where the wind howled against the mountain's edge. And he laughed. The sound was dry, hoarse, alien to his own ears. But it was laughter. That night he dreamed. He had not dreamed in years. Not since Damantine. Not since the flames. He stood in Olympia's great quarries, surrounded by boy soldiers drilling in the dark. But their faces were not his brothers. They were the faces of Macraga, of Kalth, of Terra, even of Sotha. And in the dream, Perturabo stood watching. "You failed me," the Primarch said, his voice like thunder on steel. "No," Dantioch answered. "You failed them." When he woke, the sun was rising over Sotha. Guilliman summoned him the next day. "The beacon's working," the Primarch said, hands behind his back. "We're seeing new ships arrive every week now. Civilians, isolated garrisons, refugee flotillas, and more requests for coordination than we can answer." "That's what victory looks like," Dantioch said. "It's not enough." "It never is. That's why I'm sending you here." He pointed to a dot on the map, an outlying system on the edge of the ruin storm. "What's there?" "Nothing." "Then why send me?" "Because that's where we need to start something. A forward relay, a refuge, a seed, something that can guide the next wave." "You want me to build another fortress?" "No, I want you to build hope." Dantioch did not give an answer. But 2 days later, the reliquary redoubt lifted from Sotha once more. Its lone passenger left no farewell message, no final transmission. He did not need to. In time, the outpost he founded would be called Enduring Light. It would never grow large, never become a fortress in the old sense, but it would serve as a waypoint, a haven, and a symbol. A reminder that in the dark you don't always need walls. Sometimes you just need a light. There are lights that burn with pride, banners lit in gold, engines flaring across the void, cathedrals glittering with stained glass saints, and vox prayers blaring from 1,000 towers. These are the lights that demand to be seen. And then there are the lights that do not boast, the quiet ones, the stubborn ones, the ones that flicker in forgotten corners where the darkness presses harder, and yet they refuse to go out. Warsmith Dantioch had become one of those. The system was nameless, a forgotten dot in the dark between real stars. It had no strategic value, no mineral wealth, no history. Just a lone orbit-locked moon circling a dead gas giant, its surface scarred by ancient tectonic upheaval. It wasn't listed on any Imperial chart. That was exactly why Dantioch had chosen it. He arrived with nothing. No army, no Mechanicum cohorts, no Titan legios or orbital shipyards. Only the reliquary redoubt, a hold full of salvaged, prefabricated modules, and a battered data core that contained every structural blueprint he had ever designed, revised, and redesigned again. And he began to build. It started as a shelter, just a sealed dome against the frigid wind, power drawn from geothermal vents deep beneath the moon's crust. Then came the signal spire, barely a quarter the height of those that once adorned Damantine, but strong enough to pierce local subspace and echo back toward the Pharos relay on Sotha. It did not say, "We are strong." It said, "We are here." That was enough. The first visitors were not soldiers, they were drifters. A crew of Mechanicum pilgrims who had lost contact with their forge world and wandered blindly into the system, searching for a way through the storm. Dantioch gave them shelter. He repaired their drive core. And when they left, one of their tech priests remained behind, volunteering to serve in his new colony. The second arrivals were worse off, 5 ships of civilian refugees fleeing an unknown threat. Their logs were corrupted, their navigators burned out, and their children terrified. Dantioch quartered them in the subterranean habitats, fed them from protein synth vats meant for legionaries, and put them to work reinforcing the outpost's heat shields. When they asked who he was, he only ever said, "The caretaker." They began calling him the Iron Ghost. He never corrected them. Over the next solar cycle, more came. A damaged Black Shield strike cruiser with no heraldry and half its Astartes dead. A wounded Sister of Silence whose psychic silence drove the civilians to madness, but who refused to leave. an exiled rogue trader who offered nothing but old maps, a grudge against the word-bearers, and the firepower of one slowly dying frigate. Each was given a place, not because Dantioch trusted them, but because the outpost needed them. Everyone had to serve. There were no heroes here, only survivors. They did not know the name Dantioch. He never wore his Legion colors. His armor was scorched beyond recognition, its sigils long since scraped clean. He did not speak of Damantine. He did not speak of Olympia. He did not speak of Perturabo. But at night, alone in the relay tower, he would sometimes stand before the main console and watch the stars. Not the ones above, the ones calling back. The Pharos relay had been built to shine a light through the warp, but it had become more than that. Dantioch's outpost, unnamed on any chart, had become an echo point, a place where the lost ships of the Imperium could send coordinates, ask for safe paths, and receive a single unflinching answer. We see you. In time, the outpost was given a name, not by Dantioch, but by those who arrived, lived, and passed through. They called it the Still Point. Not because nothing happened there, but because for a moment everything stopped. The war, the loss, the chaos. Out there, yes, but not here. Here, there was clarity. Not peace, but purpose. Dantioch never held court. He never ruled. He managed. He reinforced the shield generators when ash storms battered the surface. He mapped geothermal paths when seismic events threatened the underground tanks. He reviewed labor rosters, corrected faulty logic patterns, rebuilt scrap metal loaders into functional servitors. He did it with the same hands that once built citadels for a god emperor and shattered siege engines with a single hammer swing. No one ever saw him smile. One day, a boy asked him, "Are you a hero?" Dantioch looked at him for a long time, then replied, "No, I am a wall." But even the most patient wall cannot hold the storm forever. A signal arrived, faint, broken but decipherable. A fleet, Imperial, trapped near a collapsing warp breach. 2 days from total destruction. No functioning navigators, no way out. Their beacon had reached nothing else. No one else. Only Still Point. Dantioch answered. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask for credentials or proof of loyalty. He simply did what he had always done. He calculated. He worked the relay systems for 30 straight hours, coaxing every fraction of range from the beacon, every inch of power from the geothermal grid. He had to reconfigure the psychic dampeners himself, delicate work for a man with cracked fingers and ancient wounds. He burned his arm down to the nerve realigning the void jammer matrices. And when the last frequency stabilized, he sent them the coordinates. Not a path, a promise. They made it. All but one of their ships emerged into real space within half a light year of Still Point, burned, broken, but alive. The survivors wept when they saw the relay tower. It wasn't even a fortress, just a signal post wrapped in heat plating and weather shields. But to them, it was more beautiful than a cathedral. Dantioch didn't greet them. He was already back at work, rebuilding the grid, quietly, without thanks. Later, a delegation came from Sotha, Mechanicum envoys, Strategium analysts, representatives from Guillemon's new logistical corps. They offered him honors, position, authority. He said nothing for a long time, then only, "There's more work here." The envoys returned to Sotha in silence. They added one more line to the updated star charts. Still Point Station, D-Class Warp Signal Hub, non-militarized, founded by unknown entity, currently functional. They never understood the full truth, that it had been founded by a man born to build fortresses. A man forged in the legion of traitors, abandoned by his father, broken by time and steadied by choice. A man who became more than a warrior, more than a wall. A light that did not boast, that did not falter, that did not die. Still Point would never be a name known across the Imperium. But for those who passed through it, it became the proof that the Imperium still had hope. Time does not end battles, it only makes the blood harder to remember. Warsmith Dantioch had not aged like a mortal. His flesh was Astartes, enhanced, reinforced, regenerated beyond what human biology could manage. But the damage still came, not in years, in weight, in the heavy pull of each memory he carried behind the plates of his armor, in the cold ache beneath the skin where the war had soaked into the marrow. And Still Point had been quiet too long. The outpost remained, the beacon remained, the work always remained. Refugees came, wounded fleets limped in, civilian convoys rerouted through the warp, thanks to Dantioch's pulse paths, emerging burned but intact. Still Point never became larger, but its meaning grew. And with meaning came attention. The first signs were subtle. A merchant ship arrived with a false IFF code, too perfect, too clean. Dantioch spotted it before it entered orbit. He let it land, watched it, waited. 3 nights later, a generator exploded without warning. No survivors. A caution, a test. The second was bolder. A communication packet encrypted with Mechanicum subrunes came through the relay. It bore the symbols of a forged domo who had perished on Kalth years ago. The code was sound. The origin point, impossible. He decoded it anyway. It said, "The eye sees the light. It will blink." Dantioch didn't react, not outwardly, but he began sleeping in his armor again, a habit he had let go of after Damantine. He resumed patrols of the perimeter in silence, long after the others had retired to their quarters. He did not explain himself. The others had long since stopped asking. Weeks later, a boy from Still Point's growing civilian cohort found something buried in the ash, a piece of a bolter casing warped with heat. It bore the sigil of the Iron Warriors. Not Dantioch's, the 38th Grand Company. There are some wounds that never clot. Dantioch stood in the relay tower that night, staring out over the perimeter walls. His armor, patchwork and reinforced with mechanicum bracing, groaned as he moved. He had repaired it so many times it was no longer Mark 3 or 4. It was his own pattern, a Frankenstein of necessity. It no longer bore any Legion markings, just scorched gray and iron trim. He flexed his fingers slowly. The servos buzzed in the knuckle joints. "Iron within," he whispered. But there was no one left to answer. The attack came during the 40-second cycle of Still Point's central generator. It was night, if such things meant anything on that ash moon. The stars were veiled. The wind howled through the ravines, and the perimeter sensors went blind. They cut through the outer dome like knives, not with brute force, but with silence. Melta-cutters, precision, familiar. Dantioch awoke to the silence. He didn't run, he didn't rally. He walked through the corridors of Still Point's command annex, down into the sub-levels, through fire suppression clouds and hissing vents. Every step felt heavier. He knew this kind of breach. He had trained it, fought it, designed for it. And now it was being used against him. The attackers wore iron, not crude, spiked chaos parody, but Legion iron. Clean-cut Mark 3 and 4, with the sigils of old Olympia painted in dull bronze. Not screaming berserkers, not demonically enhanced monsters. Iron warriors. But they were not loyalists. They were remnants. Shattered cells of the traitor legion, survivors of shattered companies scattered after the heresy. Not many, but enough. And they had come for the man who had defied Perturabo. The firefight began in the transit tunnel. Two loyalist Black Shields, who had once served under Nicodemus, held the flank. A pair of ex-guard conscripts managed to trigger a flame trap before falling. Dantioch arrived just as the inner corridor exploded in a haze of molten ceramic and smoke. He walked through it. Bolt rounds sparked off his armor. One punched into his shoulder plate and lodged there. He didn't flinch. Gatebreaker, his thunder hammer, long since reforged from local alloys, hummed with charge. He didn't shout, he didn't challenge, he ended. 3 traitor Astartes fell in less than 6 seconds, one with a crushed chest plate, one with a snapped neck. The last he dragged down with his own body weight, tearing the helm off and driving it into a wall. But they kept coming. Stillpoint had never been built to repel a full Astartes strike. That was the point. It wasn't supposed to survive, it was supposed to guide. Dantioch fought alone. In the reactor well, 2 more loyalists died buying time to seal the heat vents. In the main relay chamber, a Sister of Silence bled out, trying to stop a demolitions charge from being planted at the core. She looked at Dantioch once, eyes burning with meaning, then died without a word. He fought through corridors he had built. Every inch was known to him, every pipe, every bulkhead, every angle. But now, they were weaponized against him. The attackers had studied him. They knew the layouts, knew the way he thought. He began to lose ground. In the final chamber, beneath the primary emitter dish, Dantioch made his stand. He activated the last set of defense turrets, overloaded the plasma relays, and set the failsafes to collapse the upper dome. It was not a strategy. It was a decision. The last traitor came through the smoke like a reflection from the past. He wore the old colors, iron and bronze. His pauldron still bore the Triskelion of the 4th Legion. His voice rasped through static. "Barabbas, you betrayed us." "No," Dantioch said. "You betrayed yourselves." Perturabo was right. We were never meant to be protectors. We were weapons, hammers, executioners of order. "No," Dantioch whispered, raising Gatebreaker. "We were builders. You just forgot the blueprints." And then he charged. When the dust settled, he stood over the broken form of his last brother, breathing hard, bleeding from 6 different rents in his armor. Sparks flickered from his leg brace. He could barely lift his arm, but he had won. Stillpoint burned, not to ash, not to destruction, but in signal. The beacon, reignited by the feedback loop of the battle, flared brighter than ever before. It pulsed across space, broadcasting a warning and a promise. It said, here was resistance, here was loyalty, here was light. It reached Sotha, it reached Macragge, it reached Terra. When the recovery fleet arrived 2 weeks later, they found a moon half ruined. But they also found survivors. A child who had hidden beneath the relay tower's supports, clinging to a transmitter. A servitor that kept the cooling tanks from overheating. A rogue trader with a broken spine who refused to let the medics leave until they found the Iron Ghost. They found him. Barabbas Dantioch slumped against the wall of the core chamber, armor fused to his body, chest rising slow and shallow beneath shattered plates. He lived, barely. When they tried to move him, he opened his eyes. "Leave the beacon," he rasped. "It still works." The medics carried him into orbit. Behind them, the beacon pulsed once more. The armor beneath the skin had held. Some men die in fire. Others fade into myth. But there are a rare few who, though broken and buried, become the soil itself, what others build upon, even if they never know the name of what holds them upright. Barabbas Dantioch was not remembered in the songs of heroes. His face was not painted on banners, nor engraved in the vaults of triumph. But the worlds he saved never forgot the way the stars lit again, because he stood where others fell. And now, at the end of a long, scarred path, the last Warsmith of iron and oaths lay dying. The medici chamber aboard the Ultramarines' recovery ship, Righteous Seal, was hushed, but not cold. The tech adepts moved like priests, voices low, footsteps softer still. Every wire and support system surrounding the bed where Dantioch lay seemed too delicate for the man it kept alive. He had not removed his armor. They couldn't. His body had fused to it after years of battle and injury, after centuries of defiance and deferred death. Where his armor ended, he began. Where he began, the scars never stopped. Muscle knit by memory, bone set by resilience. A face that hadn't seen light in decades, now exposed under the soft halo of the life support field. But his eyes, they were still sharp. Guilliman came days after the signal from Still Point reached Sotha. He did not come with fanfare. He arrived alone, as he had once met Dantioch in the shadow of Damantine's End. He stood by the bedside for some time in silence. Then the Warsmith spoke. "You came yourself. I owed you that. You still do." A flicker of something, perhaps the ghost of a smile, passed through Dantioch's voice. The tubes in his chest hissed and clicked as he breathed, and the Medaiki servitors whirred, adjusting levels. "They said you held the line again," Guilliman said quietly. "Number this time, I was the line." He coughed, a sharp metallic noise. They spoke then, not as demigod and soldier, not as primarch and subject, but as men who had seen too many battles and bled for too many truths. The conversation was not long, but it carried the weight of history. "There's something I never asked you," Guilliman said after a pause. "Then you should ask it. Why did you never build something for yourself? You had the skill to create wonders. You could have carved a legacy that echoed through Terra itself. Yet every wall, every tower, every sanctuary, you gave it away. You never left your mark." "You're wrong," Dantioch rasped. "I left it where it mattered." Guilliman lowered his head. There was no challenge left in the man before him, no strength. But there was something deeper still, unyielding. "They'll write about you, you know," the Primarch said. "Then tell them not to." "Why?" "Because they'll make it clean, neat. They'll polish the edges, strip out the blood and rust, make me something I'm not. I don't want to be a statue. I want to be a warning." Outside, the stars turned. The ship glided in orbit over Sotha, where the Pharaohs continued to pulse, now brightened by the integrated relay system first tested in Still Point. Entire sectors were stabilizing now, trade routes emerging, worlds once blind to the Imperium's presence lit again, drawn back by the pull of the beacon. And every link, every connection, traced back to a single line carved in silence. Barabbas Dantioch slipped into unconsciousness that evening. The Medici said he would not wake again. They were wrong. For 3 more days he drifted between life and death, awareness flickering like a fading signal. But in those moments, his mind wandered the places no others could reach. He saw Olympia, not as it fell, but as it once had been, with proud bastions in the cliff faces and children reciting siege theory beneath the sky. He saw Damantine, not in fire, but lit by lamps, whole, its barracks full of laughter and midnight drills, its commander walking the halls not as a ghost, but as a father. He saw Sotha and the Pharaohs shining out through the dark like the heart of a galaxy reborn. On the 4th day, his heartbeat failed. And Barabbas Dantioch, loyalist iron warrior, the forgotten son, the stone sentinel, died. There was no funeral pyre, no grand procession through the halls of Ultramar. No statue was carved. Gilliman did not declare a feast of remembrance or inscribe his name among the champions of Macragge. He simply ordered that Dantioch's body be returned to the relay tower at Still Point. And there, at the place where light had once been lost, his remains were interred beneath the emitter core, not in a tomb, but in a foundation. His armor, fused with his flesh, was buried whole, upright beneath the signal spire, a column of iron beneath the earth. Above, no marker was placed, no epitaph etched in stone, only a small signal node welded into the side of the console. When a new vessel arrives at Still Point, its augers detect the transmission before they even see the station. It is not a name. It is not a warning. It is a question encoded into the pulse. The message reads, "Are you still holding?" That was Dantioch's legacy. Not glory, not vengeance. A single moment, carried forward again and again by those who needed it, by the ones who held. Epilogue, a message lost and found. Centuries later, when the Imperium once again fractured into darkness and the Cicatrix Maledictum tore the galaxy like a knife across flesh, a small patrol ship limped toward an ancient beacon. Its crew were starved, its commander dying. They had run for weeks. They had lost all signal, all direction, and then they caught a pulse, just one line. No heraldry, no name. Just a message repeating on loop, like a hand reaching through the void. Are you still holding? The ship rerouted. They followed the signal and found Still Point. Still standing, still lit, still guarded by silence. And beneath the signal tower, far below the ash-dusted soil, a single suit of armor rests in the earth. Not waiting, not forgotten, just holding.